Thank you everybody for joining us on yet another episode of Topical Minds. This is Abdullah Kalafado. And today on this episode, we have my good friend Sanket Korgaonkar. Sanket and I go way back. We actually went to the same high school together in Dubai and then went our sort of separate ways. Sanket is an assistant professor of commerce in the finance area at the University of Virginia's McIntire School of Commerce, which I attended as part of my undergraduate studies. He teaches a course on the fundamentals of real estate finance and investments, and his research interests are broadly in the area of household finance and financial institutions, with a particular focus on the institutions of mortgage lending and consumer lending. So we will get into some of that later on in the podcast. But before that, Sanket, welcome. It's been a while. I know we sort of chatted briefly the other day, catching up after a long time, but extremely.
Yeah, thanks Abdullah for having me on. I was excited to hear back from you. I know it's been kind of like 10, 11, maybe even more years since we last spoke. Because I remember actually way more than that. 2005 was when I went off to college and left Dubai. So it's been at least 15 years since we last spoke. But I guess I kind of always knew what you were up to, I suppose, thanks to LinkedIn and everyone's updates on LinkedIn. So when I sort of first came to UVA McIntire, I was like, oh yeah, I remember Abdullah went here. I know it must have been cool to be a student here. So yeah, it's nice to connect after all these years.
Yeah, I was actually, for this podcast, I was going to bring out my UVA cap. I still have that.
Yep.
I have a ton of UVA memorabilia. Like, it's all over. Like, some of the stuff is here, some of the stuff is still in Dubai. But I've held on to that with some sort of weird religiosity and
exactly. But I can see why. I mean, it seems like I've been to a few institutions now, either studying or having been on the faculty, and it's one of it's one of the places that has, I think, the most school spirit. I think Penn State was the only place I've been that's more into the university and the sports culture as UVA is. But yeah, people are proud of the school, happy to be at Charlottesville, be from Charlottesville. It's cool.
That's awesome. So you went to Penn, of course. University of Pennsylvania, Wharton is the business school there, and that's what you attended. And it's, of course, one of the consensus top business schools on the planet. So you went there, and then you decided. What was your thought process when you were sort of exiting? Was your plan initially to get into the corporate world and then sort of see where that takes you, or did you sort of have at the back of your mind, perhaps I may want to get back into academics?
Yeah, so good question. I think I've had, I don't know, I think that my path to academia is becoming a little more common, but I think 10, 15 years ago, I would have been sort of the outlier. I think I was definitely the outlier at Wharton, who sort of wanted to go into academia later, but it was sort of a winding journey there, I would say. So back in when we were doing our A levels in Dubai, PhD academia was sort of nowhere even on the radar, and I think not because I didn't want to do it, just because I had zero awareness of what this career was, what it entailed, what the work entailed. I just, for whatever reason, whether it was my immediate surroundings or whether it was a function of being in a place like Dubai, there was just not that much exposure to this sort of line of work, I would say. So graduating school, I wanted to go to Penn and Wharton because I wanted to be a Wall Street investment banker. Like that's what my goal was. I don't know if you remember, but I think we were in the same, we took economics and A levels together. And, I loved that stuff. I loved math. I loved economics. And so finance was, one thing I wanted to study with the aim of going into corporate America, getting to Wall Street. And that's kind of what I worked towards even while I was in college. But, I think one of the amazing things about college in the US, and this is, goes for Penn, but I think this applies more generally as well, is that it really kind of encourages you to kind of like expand your sort of horizon a little bit, right? There's so many things that you can do on campus in terms of what you can study, but also in terms of how you can study, right? We tend to have this image in college of like, oh yeah, go to classes, do well on your classes, get your grades and and then go on to the next semester or the next year. But one really cool experience that I had or I sought out really when I was there was to try and do some sort of independent research. This was a little bit a function of friends of mine who in their majors, whether in the engineering school or in the arts and sciences, had to kind of write a senior thesis. And Wharton sort of for the general kind of population does not kind of have that kind of requirement. And I was like, this is really cool. Like, we've spent 3 years in this amazing institution getting all this knowledge. How neat would it be to do a project that brings all of this together, brings what I've learned in my stat course together with what I learned in my valuation course, together with what I learned in some other finance course that I really liked. And so that's when my mind started thinking, okay, let me see if there's like a senior thesis I could write. And kind of one thing led to another. They had a program where you it was really interesting. The whole kind of idea behind the program was not enough people at Wharton know what academic research is. Just because they've never been exposed to it, they've never thought about it. And so the program was like trying to give you a flavor of what that was. And the way it worked was professors kind of put out proposals. They were like, hey, I'm interested in thinking about X. And then you kind of apply to work with that professor on that topic for the course of a year. And so I managed to work with a professor at Penn, who's now at Drexel, just across the road in Philly. And the topic we were interested in was, who are sort of the non-financial firms that use asset-backed securitization markets. And we sort of went into the financial statements, constructed samples of those who used it versus those who didn't, and did all kinds of analysis on that. But that was my first, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I'm asking interesting questions, I'm learning new techniques and tools to analyze the data. Hey, here's a paper with like my name on it. That's my sort of work that's attributable to me. Professor Greg Nini was my advisor on this project, and he ended up kind of submitting it to a conference. We sort of he presented it at a couple of good conferences, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And so that's kind of how I said, okay, you know what, this might be something that I want to think about seriously pursuing as a career.
And so you were in your senior year, you came across this opportunity, you took it, you have this. Was your paper published, or were you just presenting it at conferences?
So it's a long story short, and we can get into how publication works, but we submitted it to a journal. Greg was asked to kind of combine the paper with a couple of other co-authors who had a very similar paper that they had also submitted. And at this point, I was, working at KPMG, so I was not really contributing much to this new joint project. For what it's worth, that paper does not have me as author, but hey, I'm so indebted to Greg for guiding me on this path. He wrote my letters for grad school, and he's still someone I bump into now and again at different conferences. So yeah, it was I got out of that experience what I needed to and wanted to.
So you graduated, you went off to KPMG, you worked there for, how long were you at KPMG before you decided?
A year and a half. Yeah, a year and a half. I mean, if you remember, 2009 was, when the economy was kind of not doing so well. So they had sort of delayed start dates and stuff like that. So I only started work, graduated like May 2009, but only started work in like October that year. So, and by that time I'd already started thinking, okay, what do I want to do next? I think this has always like been in my nature to always be like, okay, what's next? And, the best laid plans kind of don't necessarily sort
Work
of
out.
pan out as you
Yeah.
think, but I think it's been helpful to be like, okay, what's next? What's next? What am I doing next? And so I'd already kind of like thought about, okay, I should do my GRE, given that I have 6 months of the summer to do nothing. I kind of already laid the groundwork for possibly applying to grad school, whether that was econ programs in England, whether that was PhD programs in the US, kind of just, starting to think of the next step a little bit. Yeah.
So it's interesting because typically when individuals start to think about grad school and specifically MBAs, they typically do it to help them change their career, right? Get into a
Mm-hmm.
field that perhaps they won't be able to get into without that MBA.
Mm-hmm.
So you were at KPMG and you had sort of already started to think about perhaps pursuing higher education, and then I believe you make the move to California, and you end up
Mm-hmm.
studying at Berkeley.
That's
What
right.
what sort of led you to California, and then the career path, sort of the academic path, in the sense that you ended up doing your master's first and then decided to pursue your PhD. Um,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
it
So sorry, go on. I didn't
I
mean
was
to
I was going to
interrupt.
say, like, this is just for my information, but
Mm-hmm.
you can technically do a PhD without having to do a master's, right? So you could potentially go from your undergraduate directly to a PhD program.
Yeah. So this is like very field specific. So most econ departments, most econ programs, definitely most departments in the business school don't have what they call terminal master's degrees. Like you can't enroll for ending up with a master's degree. You can do this in engineering, right? You can go to UVA for a master's in computer science engineering, but you can't go to Berkeley for a research master's in business administration, or well, you can, and these are things are different from MBAs, but you can't sort of get a master's in whichever sort of field you want to, or Berkeley econ for that matter. You can't go to Berkeley econ and get a master's in economics. The idea is that on the way to your PhD you will pick up this degree, because your first year or 2 years, depending on the program, is spent taking coursework, and just mastering kind of the how do you say, the basics of each discipline, or the key tools and theories and techniques in each discipline. So that part kind of corresponds to your master's degree, and then of course once you kind of pass your qualifying exams, or preliminary exams, they're called different things at different institutions. That's when you actually become a doctoral candidate. That's when you're okay. Now you're actually like you have a shot at getting your PhD, and then the next few years are spent doing the research, writing your dissertation, things of that nature. So honestly, I was convinced I wanted to try a PhD program, but PhD admissions are very competitive, like super competitive. So in my mind, I was like, okay, you know what? And again, thinking one step ahead, right? I was like, if I don't get into a PhD program, let me try and do a master's program in England, because I always like the idea of living in England someday, and use that to sort of apply again to PhD programs, because my CV would have been even stronger if I had that background. So that's kind of my thinking at the time. But I was fortunate enough to sort of be admitted to Berkeley's program. I went through sort of the interview stage at Michigan as well, but Berkeley, I think, struck me as and really, I mean, I rated those two programs equally. It was a very tough choice, but Berkeley struck me as kind of a place where I would be happier living, I think, as opposed to nothing wrong with Ann Arbor. I've been to Ann Arbor, enjoy Ann Arbor, but I've always been in urban environments, and I think I would have just been happier there. So given that institutions were basically in my eyes the same, or equal in quality and stature, I was like, okay, let me kind of decide to you know let sort of lifestyle be the tiebreaker there, right? And I think it's important, because you spend 6 years in this fairly stressful environment, trying to figure things out. Grad school, there's surveys and stuff that have been shown that grad students are more prone to things like high stress, depression, and things like that. So I was like, look, if I'm going to put myself through this, I might as well be happy doing it. So that's kind of was the decision that led to Berkeley over Michigan. But yeah, I mean, that takes nothing away from Michigan. It's a great institution as well.
So you get into the PhD program, and one of the things that you often hear, and we were sort of briefly talking about this the other day, but when I was doing my MBA in Montreal, I did have a few professors who mentioned that it would be good for me to pursue a PhD, and they felt as though I would be a good candidate. But I remember sort of weighing at that point some of the pros and cons that I had come across, and one of them is, of course, once you do get your PhD, typically the institution that you get your PhD at will not necessarily give you a teaching job, right? So you will likely have to reach out to other institutions to try and get that initial gig. And then the second thing was also getting back, if I did decide to get back into the corporate world, there are often challenges that you can encounter just because you've got a lot of academic experience, but you don't necessarily have practical work experience, and that's sometimes a feedback that you get from PhD students, that we're not really able to get internships, we're not really able to get jobs just because we're competing with individuals who have several more years of actual practical work experience.
Right.
Did that cross your mind at all when you had entered?
Yeah. So I think the way I thought about it was like, so, to be completely honest, I don't think I realized how challenging the job market was when I started the PhD. I kind of heard about it like, there's a huge oversupply of PhDs. There's always more PhDs than there are open positions. And some disciplines are kind of more exposed to this problem than finance and economics. Not that it doesn't exist in our field, but things like the humanities, etc. It's very, new positions, new tenure track positions are very scarce. So I kind of had this inkling, but, I thought to myself, look, I'm going to get a PhD in sort of econ, finance, real estate-ish related topics. I was like, I'm employable, right? These are skills that translate to other industries. And so, hey, worst case scenario, I don't end up getting a faculty position or an academic job. I might need to do some soul searching to figure out what I want to do next, but I have the skills to do it. So that's sort of initially when I got into the program. And then, it kind of becomes a question of like, okay, do I really want to go for an academic position? Do I want to push myself down that path? It's a crazy process, the academic job market. And I applied to sort of faculty positions all over the place. I applied as, again, I was hoping it would just be a backup plan, which touch what it turned out to be. I applied to some econ consulting shops like Nera, Cornerstone, places like that, and that was kind of the extent of my job search. And I said, okay, if none of this pans out, then we'll kind of take a step back and sort of reassess. But I want to come back to the point you said about like PhDs find it challenging to find jobs in industry. I can see sort of why that might be the case, in the sense that, yes, you've been out of the workforce for a while, you've been in a very different environment. But honestly, I think it's a question of like marketing yourself well. If I think about this, and again, this might vary discipline to discipline, right? But what are the qualities you develop on the way to getting your dissertation and completing your dissertation? It may not be corporate strategy, it may not be corporate finance, but you've shown an incredible amount of perseverance if you've been able to get to the end of your PhD. You've shown an incredible amount of self-motivation, because literally there's not, it's rare that an advisor kind of like is following up with you and making sure you're doing things. It's your responsibility to set up meetings with your advisor, go to him or her, show them your work, get feedback on your work. It's entirely up to you. So your journey through that research process has been on your motivation, right? So that's a huge quality that you leave with. The PhD, yes, your classes teach you the basics, but they don't get, and they maybe get you like with one step to the cutting edge. But if you really want to push the envelope, it's up to you to teach yourself the methods that you might learn. Classes don't teach you everything. You have to figure out a lot of stuff for yourself in the course of writing your dissertation. So you've been thrown into situations where you maybe knew very little and you very quickly have had to come up to speed. So I think it's just how you sell it, right, to a potential employer. Yes, I may not have worked in tech or corporate finance or whatever for years at this point, but hey, I have all these qualities which and you can stand by the fact that you have kind of proved yourself on these dimensions, because without that there was no way you were completing your dissertation. So I really think it's about you know doing some thinking about, okay, what qualities have I developed more abstractly, and then saying these are all things that employers want. Whichever employer you speak to will want these qualities in someone they're looking to hire.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, especially for individuals who are currently either PhD students or who are looking to get into a PhD program and then have to eventually make their way out of a PhD program and either enter the workforce or look at continuing that academic journey. But I did want you to elaborate a little bit more on that marketing piece. If you had to give somebody suggestions, you could have a very good understanding of what it is that you gained out of the PhD program. You mentioned being able to take that initiative, being able to have that sort of self-motivation, that drive.
Yep.
How does one actually get to a point where you are able to communicate these qualities that you have developed over the course of your PhD journey to an employer? Oftentimes, you apply and your resume doesn't even get seen, and you don't really even get a chance to have that conversation where you can sell yourself. How do you get past that initial hurdle, if you have any thoughts
Want to go
on how?
down that path? I mean, again, it's not something I thought sort of too deeply about, I
Yeah.
guess, because I've been blessed to have an opportunity to be in academia today. But um, one thing having been again at a few different institutions now, one thing that's always the common denominator across these is that they have great resources in terms of career services, right? So, if you're at a good institution, companies are coming to hire and recruit. They're having recruiting events. Go to them. Go to your school's career service office and be like, hey, can someone take a look at my resume? Right? That's at least the basic thing to start out with. And then, rely on your network. Whether it's academia or not academia, your network is super important, super crucial. This is something I personally think I can kind of improve on, is just sort of cultivating that network a little bit, and it's something I'm trying to work on. But you can send your resume to friends you went to college with and be like, hey, what do you think? Like, give me some feedback. You can send it to people you haven't spoken to in a while and be like, hey, I know you work here. Can you tell me? I think it's just a little bit, and this is true of all job markets. I don't think this is specific to academia or not academia. You kind of have to put yourself out there a little bit, which is, sometimes easier said than done. But it just takes a little bit of that going out of your comfort zone, as so many things do.
And if you take a look at PhD students, would it be fair to say that the majority of PhD students intend on continuing that academic journey, and not actually are looking to get into the job market? Is that a fair assessment?
Again, this is highly sort of discipline specific. When it comes to things like finance and economics, most folks, at least come in thinking about an academic career. And I'm going to define sort of academic career more broadly when it comes to econ, because you can work at, a think tank or a Federal Reserve Bank and do great academic research. So I kind of consider those sort of pseudo academic positions as well. But, of course, you divide your time between policy and research rather than sort of teaching and research. So I would say, when it comes to econ, finance, sort of the business school disciplines, yes, most people are looking to sort of continue on in academia. I can't say the same for engineering, for example, because there's so many different paths that you can take after an engineering PhD. I've had friends do engineering PhDs and then just join various industries. So again, highly sort of discipline specific, I would say. Yeah.
And then another question, getting back to the actual PhD experience and making sure that that is as successful as it could possibly be for you, and publishing and making sure that's a major piece of it, right? Like do you have to have a certain number of publications before you can actually qualify to complete your program?
Again, highly discipline specific. Some things, and the reason this varies by discipline is because what we call sort of the publishing cycle really is different from one discipline to the other. Econ and econ related disciplines have traditionally, but even more so recently, have sort of really long publication cycles. It takes a few months or longer for a journal to get back to you. They ask you to make revisions. I mean, they say that one thing you have to get really comfortable with in academia is rejection, because the sort of the median outcome is typically a rejection from a journal, just because there are so many papers being submitted to the top journals and they're highly selective. And so then you get back on that horse, you make the improvements that you think you want to make, and you send it off to the next journal. But then again, it's a few months wait to kind of hear back from them. So it's in a discipline like econ, there are really long publication cycles, and so traditionally you may have one publication when you sort of graduate, or you may have something in what we call the revise and resubmit stage, where a journal has said, hey, we want you to make these improvements to it, and then submit the paper again. So it's as in econ, at least, what I see is that as kind of co-authorships and as having co-authored chapters of your dissertation is becoming more common, then yes, it's sort of, you can push out stuff faster, and you're more likely to have something that's published when you graduate. Or if you worked with your advisor, you guys have managed to sort of get something out that's been published. But I know, like in engineering disciplines, for example, there is some, or I think I've known students who are sort of bioscience PhDs, and there you require a certain number to actually get your PhD. Again, so I know in my discipline, at least, it was not. It was considered a massive bonus if you had a good publication. It was like, okay, this guy's proved himself on this dimension. So you try for it, but it's not kind of necessary by any means. Yeah. But what you are expected to have is 2 or 3 fairly complete academic papers, and the style of writing dissertations has again sort of changed a little bit over time. And maybe 20-30 years ago, from what I can see, people used to kind of have 3 very closely related pieces of work, and that was their dissertation. The norm now, or what's becoming more common, I would say, is people kind of have, there's usually a common thread running through them. So like my dissertation had 3 chapters, all of which were about kind of mortgage finance. But 2 of them were on one specific theme. The third one was something very different. So, you're seeing a lot more variety in what constitutes a dissertation. Earlier dissertations tended to have very specific, this is the topic of the dissertation. Now you often see names like, essays in sort of mortgage finance or something like that. Just a general title to tie together, what might be 3 related but still disparate chapters. So that's what you're expected to have. You're expected to sort of prove that you are sort of capable of good scholarly work through the course of those 2, 3, or 4 years sometimes.
So that's, and then once you get through that, like once you've demonstrated those qualities, those abilities to come up with, really good literature and papers, essentially you have to, the next step is you go towards defending your actual dissertation, right? And then once you get through that, then you've sort of you're given this, go ahead certificate. Yes, you've accomplished, you've ended your PhD program successfully.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. That's sort of how it works. The one difference, I guess, in sort of econ or econ related fields is that you kind of have the job market happen before you even defend your dissertation. Academia can be quite strange sometimes. So it's you kind of go up there's basically a giant coordinating mechanism called the ASSA, Association of Social Sciences of America, or something like that. Everyone calls it the ASSA meetings, which happen every January, and that's where all schools show up to sort of recruit and interview students. So they've been doing it online for the last year. So you kind of like have to have your main, dissertation chapter very polished and ready to go by that point. And then, you spend a couple of months kind of doing the, interviewing, flying out to visit different schools or institutions. And then you kind of come back to, I came back to Berkeley and then spent last 2-3 months just polishing up each chapter of my thesis, getting it in its final form. So, the sort of the go ahead to yes you will, so the chances are if you get to that stage of your PhD, that you are going to, your faculty are not going to like not give you the PhD. They might give you a hard time about it and make you make a lot of changes, but they've sent you off to look for a job. They've written your letters of recommendation. That is with the confidence that yes you will sort of end up finishing your thesis. And again, this is institution specific. Berkeley actually did not have a formal sort of dissertation defense. I think that's true of the big UC schools as well. You kind of have a dissertation proposal phase where you again form a committee and present what you are going to work on, but your final dissertation is you have to give it to all your advisors to read and they sign off on it, but there's no formal sort of defense of it. And I thought this was just like my department, but no, I have a friend he did his, I think, electrical engineering dissertation at UCLA. And he was like, yeah, we didn't really have a defense either. So I think, again, varies from school to school. So yeah, but that's sort of generally what the process of winding up looks like. Yeah.
And then you mentioned the SSSA. So how exactly does that work? It's basically, you have these PhD students, they fly out and they meet with potential schools who essentially indicate their interest in bringing them on as professors.
Yeah. So there's an application process that sort of gets going in kind of October, November. Again, this varies. Econ has a very centralized system where you kind of upload your the main paper of your dissertation, your CV, your letters of recommendation, and you kind of hit submit and it goes out to like a ton of schools. Finance programs, real estate programs that I applied to weren't as coordinated. So I literally had to like submit, I think I submitted like 100 applications. And then, this conference, I think it's the Allied Social Sciences Association or something like that. That's what ASSA stands for. Every sort of year in the first week of Jan, there's this massive conference where all the schools typically show up. So and I'm talking about like around the world, right? There's European schools that show up, and it's a conference. It's an academic conference, but in some ways that conference is usually like a sideshow to all the interviewing that's taking place behind the scenes. And I guess economists are kind of good at creating these coordination mechanisms. So it works out perfectly because you can go to one place to network with your colleagues, interview a bunch of kids, and because all the schools are there, the graduating PhD students also time is well spent because they can just go from one interview to the other. So it's this massive circus that happens, which didn't happen last year. It's supposed to be in Boston in January. We'll see how that pans out. No one's really sure what's going to happen at this stage.
But this time you'll be going to recruit?
I've not been clued into the UVA plans. But yeah, if we were recruiting, that's where we would go. Though, from what I've been hearing, a lot of departments were quite happy to do virtual interviews, sort of last year, just by necessity. So I won't be surprised if that becomes kind of the way at least like 50% of this works right now. It's just logistically that much easier for students, for for the interviewing faculty and things like that. I still struggle to see how it would be the same as sitting in a room with 2 or 3 people and kind of talking to them. I've never felt that personal, sitting in the room interaction translates well to Zoom, however good technology might get. So yeah, but it's got pros and cons. It's got pros and cons.
And I want to hear about how you decided on UVA. What was that? What was that thought process? What was the thought process
Yeah.
behind it? How did you end up at UVA?
Yeah, so so my first position out of grad school was actually at Penn State, and again, an institution that I really respect. As a young faculty, they really kind of made me feel very comfortable. They, gave me all the resources I needed. They gave me, the sort of the ability to kind of organize the academic seminar series so that I could use that as a sort of networking opportunity. It was, I still have a lot of fond memories of the university, but again, through the sort of network, through going to conferences, I got a chance to meet with a couple of folks who were on the faculty at UVA, and they were looking for someone to sort of come and teach the real estate course that they have here, and that's kind of what I've been teaching for the longest time, whether as a TA in grad school or as a faculty at Penn State. So I came down, you sort of do the visit, you give a talk at the university, and I think it was like the alignment of a number of things. I was about to get married. I think this was, I just gotten engaged at that point when I came out to UVA. So again, you're thinking of, okay, where is a place that both you and your spouse can kind of have a career. She's sort of very career oriented as well, so wanted to be in a place where she can have the opportunity she wants, and I think that's kind of what made the difference in some sense. Charlottesville, it's a small town, of course, it's not a big city, but it has a bit more kind of a services industry around here. It's got proximity to Washington, D.C., and at least the suburbs of Washington, D.C., which also have a lot of corporations sort of headquartered or with offices there. It just kind of made it easier for us to see a future together where we could both feel sort of fulfilled in our careers. And that without having to kind of compromise on the quality of the institution, right? It's not as if I was moving from Penn State to a city, but the institution was not going to be as good as Penn State. It was moving to a pure institution while getting all these advantages, and so that's ultimately kind of what sort of led to the decision to sort of move out to Charlottesville. Yeah.
So it sort of checked all of the different boxes for you and it just made all the sense.
Yeah. And I think the one thing to I think this is true of every recruiting process, but maybe more so academia for some reasons. I don't know. I've not really gone through many other recruiting processes, but there's a lot of noise, right? And so, you may get some opportunities, but not others. But then 2-3 years down the line, other opportunities might come up. And so it was just one of those things that kind of seemed to sort of happen at the right time. And yeah, I think you kind of say, okay, this is all checks out. This is a good move on all dimensions. No one's sort of compromising anything. So yeah, we sort of decided so I moved in like mid 2019. She moved here after we got married. Yeah.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, UVA's McIntire School of Commerce is consistently ranked. It's one of the top business schools in the States. It's got a very, very strong reputation in the US market, and a lot of the students graduating end up at top sort of organizations, be it on Wall Street or just anywhere in the States. But it's got a very good reputation, and it's got some extremely strong and well-known faculty members as well. So I mean, definitely a good choice. I wanted to get a little bit into your research interests. Mm-hmm. How did you you had mentioned, when we were in Dubai, you had always been interested in economics and math and stats and finance. How did you decide to focus on mortgage lending solutions and consumer lending? How did you end up on that?
Yeah.
And how do you apply some of the stuff that you've come across in your research to some of the sort of things that we are seeing in multiple different markets across the globe? I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on in Canada, but in several cities in Canada, you've seen significant property appreciation, and it's sort of been going on for the longest time. So it'd be interesting to get your take on it from you having that sort of background, bringing in
Sure.
the economics knowledge as well as some of the real
Sure,
estate.
sure. Yeah, so let me kind of answer the first part or speak a little bit more about the first part of that. It was, again, a very sort of non-linear road. So I think it started a little bit with the sort of like the senior thesis I wrote in college. So as I mentioned, the idea was, this was just 08, 09, right? So the crisis had just happened. Asset-backed commercial paper markets had collapsed, and the my advisor, his sort of idea was that, look, these markets have a really bad name now because they were all abused by the people sort of underwriting bad loans and securitizing them using these markets. But do these markets actually have value? Who are the firms that use commercial paper as a source of financing? And we realized that there's a big chunk of firms that use it to is basically securitize accounts receivables. And then we kind of said, documented, okay, who are these firms? They're not really small firms. They're not really large firms. They sort of tend to be medium size. Again, not like unrated, but not like the greatest credit rating either, decent credit ratings. And so we kind of characterized, okay, who exactly are these firms? What's kind of is there a valuation impact we see when they enter these agreements? And so that was kind of my first general interest, right? It was like, how do firms sort of finance themselves? What kind of markets for different forms of financing exist? And then just really broadly, how does that matter for the economy at large, right? The macro economy. That's kind of the big kind of theme I went into grad school sort of curious about. And then grad school is like a massive adventure, right? It's like literally drinking out of a fire hose because you're learning so much so fast. And, I was a little lost, I think, when I first sort of finished my exams and was trying to figure out what my dissertation was going to be about. And then I'd taken a couple of courses on sort of game theory, contract theory, and just, the big idea here is, how do different agents interact strategically, right? Under different assumptions about the information each of them have, the constraints each of them face, and why does this lead to interesting economic outcomes? And so I was like, what, this stuff is really interesting. And at the time, Berkeley and had sort of started this process of just accumulating massive data sets on various corners of real estate and mortgage markets. And it's a process that's continued for a while, and they've done sort of really well on that dimension. And we had this data that my eventual advisor at the time had acquired, which was essentially all the data underlying privately securitized mortgages. So private label mortgage-backed securities, again, markets pretty much collapsed since 08, 09, but that was kind of the big boom bust that had happened was due to private label MBS, as opposed to mortgage-backed securities created by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. I can
Can
go
you
into, yeah.
But before that, can you just for people who may not know what
Sure.
private label mortgage backed securities actually refers to?
Yeah, okay. So let's start with the basics, right? What's a mortgage-backed security? So let's say tomorrow you go to Bank of America and take out a loan, right? Bank of America is not going to hold this loan on its balance sheet as an asset, right? You are the debtor, the bank is the creditor, the loan is an asset to them, but they want to convert this to cash. So they're going to sell it off to someone in a secondary market. And then Bank of America is not going to own that loan anymore. Where does that loan typically end up? Well, it ends up in what we call sort of a securitization trust. So think of this as sort of a special purpose entity that its sole job is to own these mortgages. And then it basically issues bonds to finance the ownership of these loans. And then, when you, Abdullah, make your mortgage payment every month, it's not going to Bank of America, it's going to the securitization trust, which then distributes it to the bondholder. So this is kind of the way in which mortgage has been financed in the US for the longest time. Now, there are typically there are sort of two giant entities today who issue mortgage-backed securities, and that's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And then they have a long history, which I won't get into. But at the time, and I'm talking about like now 2000 to 2005-06, there was a massive increase in the amount of these mortgage-backed securities created by the Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, JP Morgan's, Bank of America's, Merrill Lynch's, and the hedge funds of the world. Yep. So that's why they're private label MBS, because they're separate from kind of what we call agency MBS, which is that issued by the big US agencies. And so, I had this really cool data, and not only did I have data on like every loan that sat in these MBS, but I could also kind of observe the structure of the MBS. I could see how many bonds were created. I could see who were the guys who had originated the loans and underwritten the deals. Was there an overlap between those parties? Who was the entity that was responsible for managing these pools of mortgages? Was Bank of America managing the loans that they had originated, or had they sort of sold off the rights to manage those loans to a third party who we call the mortgage servicer? And so that got me thinking about, okay, what interesting kind of interactions can arise between all these different parties? And so that kind of got me thinking about mortgage finance and the institutions involved in it. So that was kind of my gateway to that world in some sense. Yeah.
And then you ended up also shifting focus, and they're slightly related, right? Like you've got mortgage institutions, and you've also got consumer lending. Consumer lending, of course, would include other things aside from just mortgages, right? Like mortgages would just be a type.
Yeah. So typically, I mean, mortgages are, I still find it interesting and fascinating because it's, the largest piece of debt that someone typically has on a household's balance sheet, if you think of it. Yep. And it's used to own the largest asset that most people own, which is the house they live in. But of course, there's a much broader world out there. And I think this is something I've tried to do, in the last couple of years, since I've kind of tried to think about more sort of, how do I say, been more deliberate about, okay, what's my kind of body of work going to look like, is to say, okay, there's this rich array of instruments that households can use, right? Credit cards, student debt. I mean, now you're seeing like buy now, pay later. There's all kinds of crazy things out there. And, these things might also matter for decisions such as what jobs do I take? Where do I locate? Do I have, am I relatively unconstrained in making decisions such as what to consume, how to consume, so on and so forth. So, I'm still trying to sort of I'm still trying to get into a specific research question related to consumer lending, but that's somewhere I want to go with my research because I think there are interesting interactions between the kinds of consumer debt people use more generally and their ability and how they use mortgages. And also because, mortgages are a massive market, but, if you look at the US, 60-ish percent of people own the house they live in. That still leaves 45% who do not own the house and likely don't have a mortgage. So it's also an important sort of chunk of the household sort of finance, household credit market. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about that piece of it.
So coming back to the mortgage finance piece of it, and of course, it seems as though you've got some very good insight in terms of how the market will unfold, just given the different players and what's actually happening between these different players. I'm wondering now, just looking specifically and just to provide you with a bit of context, what's been going on in Ontario specifically is they've seen significant growth in the prices of property for just under, I would say, a decade, and it's been happening. Every year it's sort of the same story. Will these prices continue to go up? Is the price increase sustainable? And you've got people on both sides of the table who are pointing to, these economic factors. Well, core demand is still there. We've still got immigration. Interest rates are still fairly low. And there's all these things that are keeping the momentum sort of going. And on the flip side, you have people who are saying, okay, well, wages aren't going up nearly as quickly as. So, what does that mean in terms of affordability, and what does that mean in terms of people's ability to actually manage the cost of that mortgage? Have you been able to sort of take some of the findings that, have you been able to connect some of the findings that you came across in your research to things that you've actually seen play out aside from what took place in the 2009?
Sure. So, we'll come back to the housing markets in a second. I think that's fascinating. Just to sort of give you a bit more detail on sort of what my sort of research looks at. So it's sort of more tangentially related to housing markets in the sense that because housing is the underlying asset to a mortgage, you kind of have to think carefully about what's going on in housing markets. But where sort of my research has really focused on, especially the couple of chapters of the dissertation that are sort of the most complete that I'm trying to get published right now, is what happens when borrowers can't make their payments. And a paper that I'm sort of just working on right now and just sort of trying to polish up is essentially saying, okay, what's the best way to renegotiate a loan? And it's actually been kind of neat. My paper, it studies the last crisis. So, one can argue we've kind of already passed the next recession. But, one thing that I saw in the last in the last year was it seems that the lessons from 0809 have been learned. So what happened in 0809, and this happened in the US, was when the government intervened to sort of renegotiate loans, I don't think it was very clear what the best way of doing that was. And kind of what sort of became evident in the years after the crisis was, and again, I'm not the only one who's sort of said this. There's a good literature that's also kind of sort of said these things, is that what you want to ideally do is the constraint. Let's put it this way: the constraint people were hitting was not that my house value has collapsed, I can't make the monthly payment, right? It was I have lost my job, or my income has fallen. It was a liquidity constraint as opposed to sort of an asset or a wealth constraint. And so then in that case, what you want to do, like forgiving a loan is not really going to help anyone if you're still asking them to make the same monthly payments. What you want to do is just reduce their monthly payment as much as possible. And what we say, you can think of it as delaying the repayment of the debt as much as possible, right? And after the last crisis in 0809, that was achieved by extending the terms of these loans. So if you had a 30-year mortgage, the term got extended to 40 years, right? You still owe the same amount of money, you're just paying it off a bit more slowly, and that reduces your monthly payment. What we've seen in 2020 was immediately Fannie, Freddie, the FHA, the big regulators in the US said, okay, forbearance programs are going to be open for everyone. Okay, don't make your monthly payment for as long as you need. They're going to take those missed payments, add it to your principal balance, and that's all going to be due as a balloon payment or as a lump sum payment when you finally repay your loan.
Right.
And so this was something, again, clearly a lesson that was learned in the last crisis that was being implemented this time around. And everyone, I think the consensus is that program has been, I'm sure there have been hiccups in implementing it, but it was much more informed strategy when sort of the COVID-19 kind of hit in 2020. So that's one sort of direct link to sort of my work. Now coming back to housing markets, yeah, I think this is super interesting, and so one thing I was trying to look up these statistics actually yesterday. So because I was trying to see whether the situation in Canada kind of parallels what's going on in the US, right? So US too has seen this astronomical increase in house prices. And I actually don't know this. You're right. The sort of the house price to income statistic is what one needs to look at. But the story in the U.S. kind of by most accounts seems to be that this is not a sort of a quote unquote bubble, as was in hindsight what happened in 08, 09, but this is really an issue of constrained supply. If you look at sort of new residential investment that's and just the flows into this quantities over the last 20 years, it increased dramatically in the run up to 08, 09, and then it collapsed. And it's not recovered since then, especially when it comes to single family homes. Yes, multi-family apartment buildings, a lot of those have been constructed, but there's little, there's not been too much stock of new single family homes that have been
hit the
built.
market. Yeah.
And this is what people are looking at as those starter homes, as their first house that they want to buy. That's generally what people look to acquire. And so Econ 101, right? You keep supply constrained, and as demand increases, prices are going to go up. So I think that's kind of the story in the US at this stage. I would be curious to know what that supply number looks like in Canada. And I was trying to look it up last night, but after a while on the Bank of Canada statistics page, I was like, okay, it's time to go to sleep. So I stopped at that point. But yeah, I'd be curious to learn more about that.
Yeah, from a supply standpoint, there's definitely there's definitely a shortage, and whatever units do hit the market, they tend to sort of get picked up really quickly. But at the same time, coming back to that metric that you mentioned, house price to income, is that sort of the key metric that one should be? What is that metric tell you? Is it a leading indicator? Is it a lagging indicator? What is it sort of? How is it used?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Again, this is sort of not, you can kind of look at this and say, okay, what's causing this to go up or go down? So think about it this way, right? If what is the value? Where does the value of an asset come from? The value of an asset comes from the cash flows that it generates, right? Finance 101, right? So if you think of a house, and let's say this is not a house to be occupied by the owner, but it's a house to be rented.
Investment.
What's the cash flow of that house? The rent someone is paying. If incomes are going up in sort of lockstep with house prices, you might say, okay, I would expect sort of rents to go up as well, as for whatever, as the forces of economics kind of play themselves out. And this should translate to an increase in house prices. Those things are moving kind of at the same rate. Okay, this doesn't look sort of completely unsustainable. You can write many stories, right? Incomes are going up. People can now afford more expensive houses, so the price of the house goes up, or they just bid up the price of houses that are transacted. It's when those two start to disconnect that you kind of have to say, okay, what's going on, right? So one thing, again, you can look at the last crisis where there was this disconnect between house prices and income. And a lot of that, again, the jury's, there's still a debate about this, but for sure, the creation of loans that cater to people with lower income, that allowed them to, buy properties with lower income, was contributing to that disconnect. And I think the other thing it tells us is, you're right, the affordability of housing, right? We may not be in a bubble in the US today, but that still doesn't mean housing is affordable, right? The affordability of housing still might be declining if house prices sort of continually go up. And so I think those are the sort of the two things I sort of take away from that kind of a indicator. Not sure if it exactly answers leading indicator. I have to think about that. Is that a leading indicator or lagging indicator? Leading or lagging of what would be my question.
Leading of like a potential correction in prices, like
Right.
let's assume like your like so the way I think about it is if the house price to income ratio continues to rise, I would imagine at some point you would say, okay, this could be a cause for concern, right? Like, and perhaps like looking historically, one could say, hey, and I don't know what the house
Yeah.
price to
Yeah.
income ratio would have been like
Yeah.
prior to the collapse, or if there was any sort of
Yeah.
relationship, because you mentioned incomes weren't rising nearly as quickly as
Yep. Yep.
property prices were, right?
Yep.
But if one were to basically take that ratio and over time say, hey, it seems as though right before there was a correction,
Yeah. It
be it a five,
cycles
whatever.
around something. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, um,
Did I like get you thinking
no, no,
about
no.
something?
You did. I'm just trying to see, like, so I think I think then what it points you to is, okay, what's going to be potentially the spark that lights a correction, and is that good? And that might then you might say, okay, what that spark might be is something related to the affordability of housing. And if housing becomes too expensive, if there's a movement in interest rates in one direction or the other, you might have suddenly people kind of exit the housing market and say, okay, with my low income and these higher interest rates, I'm not able to afford. So I think it points you towards the mechanism that might lead to a change in house prices. That's kind of how I would sort of think about how to use something like that. I
Yeah,
would
I
say.
agree. I think
Yeah.
the way, and I mean, these are just, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I think one of the ways that, one could look at it is like you have that ratio and then you could basically say, okay, well, what is the ratio a function of? It's a ratio of, like you said, supply and demand. It's a function of all these different variables. And then one could basically look at potentially isolate each one of those variables and say, this could be one of the driving factors for X, Y, and Z, or whatever
Yep.
it is, right? Like
Yep.
it could
Yep.
be a way to, it could be a
Yep.
way to look at that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder what the ratio is for Canada now. I might even just try and find that
Yeah,
just to
and
see.
I'm sure you can. Like you can, basically you need like median income and
Hmm.
like median house prices and take the ratio of those two, and you should get. The other cool thing I saw on the Canadian sort of the statistics website I was on was they kind of had things broken out by like new houses, existing houses that were resold, which I also thought was interesting. It would be fascinating to, I wonder if this exists somewhere in the US or existing data source. But the other thing to think about is like, and this is why real estate and housing is fascinating. There's a huge spectrum of like where you can add supply, right? As house prices increase, what developers are then trying to do, and especially as land prices increase, is build high-end homes, right? Because that's, if I'm buying an expensive plot of land, especially in a dense urban environment like Toronto or somewhere in the US, that investment will pay off if I build a really high quality house and sell it for a really high amount. So what this sort of creates then is more and more incentive to develop really high end housing.
Hmm.
But that's sort of not really where the shortage is, right? The shortage and the sort of the affordability issue is at the lower end where people can't get into starter homes, and things like that. So you kind of also have to think across the spectrum of like, okay, when we're talking about demand and supply, yes, we can talk more generally, but if you're talking about specific problems like affordability, then you kind of narrow down into one segment of the market versus the other.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting. Where do you plan on taking? You mentioned briefly, like coming up with that specific research question when it comes to consumer lending. But where do you sort of see, your academic journey taking you over the next couple of years? Do you sort of do you have any plan? Do you have any interesting projects underway? Some interesting papers you're working on?
Sure. Yeah. So, so I'll start by saying I'm still very junior in this. I'm a little kid in this environment right now, and so what I have is sort of a tenure track position. So the idea is I have sort of 5 or 6 more years to go up for promotion to tenure, right? And so what gets you tenure, writing good papers, writing papers that are published well and well cited, and just kind of getting your name out there in your field. And I think importantly, like carving out like a little sort of niche area for yourself. So hence the need to now be a bit more deliberate about, okay, what projects am I taking on, and sort of how are they going to help me build my portfolio so I can make a case for, yes, you should promote me to tenure. So that's kind of what the sort of 5-6 year focus is. The big goal is sort of over these 5 or 6 years. There's a couple of ways to sort of achieve that. One is, of course, do good work, do interesting work. And so, there's sort of two broad themes that I want to kind of explore. And I kind of want to move away from, not that I think mortgages are not interesting. I think there's been a lot of research done on mortgages. And so now kind of to publish in the good journals, you need to write something new, exciting, interesting, right? So I think there's a lot more to be done in other areas, and that's where I want to push a little bit. I really like to think about, or what I've enjoyed thinking about the last couple of years as I've sort of tried to develop new research is, how different markets interact. I think I was telling you this a little bit yesterday. So, for example, we have the labor market is a super important market, right? And the labor market is a market which has, forget the last year, even before that, been undergoing massive changes. You talk about the rise of automation, you talk about the rise of high-skilled jobs. David Otter and his sort of co-authors at MIT, Harvard have kind of documented that, what has been going on in the US is faster employment growth and earnings growth in either the really low or the really high skilled jobs, with kind of hollowing out of the middle, as they call it. And so then the question is, okay, what implications does this have for the way people make credit choices, right? Is credit going to be allocated to one group of people versus the other? Is credit going to be allocated to one geography versus the other? How do labor markets and credit markets interact? So that's kind of one big theme I want to explore a bit further. I'm also, one thing I've sort of become curious of, I've always kind of been curious about it and enjoyed it, though I've never worked directly on these topics, is sort of urban economics and neighborhood choice, right? People choose deliberately to live in one geography versus the other, and they make those choices under constraints, whether it's income constraints, wealth constraints, or just preferences for one kind of neighborhood versus the other. And again, that's something I've been always wondered, right? Like, we talk about credit flows, we talk about, these boom bust cycles in credit. How do they kind of shape the urban environment? Does credit allow people to move to one neighborhood versus the other? Does it relax constraints when it comes to neighborhood choice? So these are kind of two things that have kind of piqued my interest in the last sort of year or so. And again, they've been a little bit on the back burner as I try to kind of get my dissertation published, but I'm kind of looking forward to starting to think about them a bit more carefully. I'm in the process of collecting the kind of data that I might need to get at some of these questions. And so, yeah, hope maybe in a year if we chat again, I'll have some findings for you.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say maybe on the next one we can talk about your how you've progressed and what you're looking at now. Okay, so I think we've done over an hour here. I think we covered some really good information. Again, it's been extremely, I was sort of extremely excited to have you on, just because we haven't really connected in the longest time. And we were pretty close when we were in school together, even though we would compete pretty hard when it came to
contests. Yeah, exactly.
When it came to but I remember nobody was surprised when you ended up going to UPenn. We were like, all right, it's Sanket, whatever. Like,
funny story. So I don't know if you remember, but our econ teacher was like she drove us really hard. I remember, she was very like strict with grading.
She was great.
And she was awesome, but she was very, she definitely like pushed us a lot. And I still remember the day I got into Penn, was also the day I actually failed an econ test because like I got like, 50% or something like that on the test, but I went and took the paper with a big grin on my face because I just gotten into
Got
pen
into
and I was
pen.
so happy. But I still have that enduring memory from econ in St. Mary's in Dubai. But yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Sanket, for being
Oh,
on.
thanks so
It
much for
was
having me. This was really fun, and all the best. This sounds like, I'm curious to see where you go with this, and yeah, I'll tune into some of your other podcasts too.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's very early days. So for all of you who are tuning in, thank you for tuning in to Topical Minds. Again, if you liked what we talked about today, please make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share. We will be available. You'll be able to find Topical Minds on Spotify, Apple, and the video version of the podcast will be available on YouTube. So feel free to access it however you please. This is Abdullah Kalafaro, and I will see you on the next one.